Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And today I have a solo episode. I'm going to talk about building muscle in a deficit. So some mistakes around it, how to do it, things that improve your ability to be able to do it, and everything in between there. I'll talk about some training stuff that you need to work on as well too, and what I think training should look like there. But first, before I dive into that, I do have my one-on-one coaching. And if you are looking to build some muscle, maybe lose some body fat, maybe you want to learn more about a body recomp, or you want that yourself, or maybe you need to learn how to change your body comp with performance-related goals, or maybe you just want to improve your performance, maybe you want to improve your recovery and how you feel from day to day, maybe you just don't feel like you have, then my one-on-one coaching is for you. Again, I'm always looking to add people that are motivated to want to learn more and take things for some people to the next level, but just are also ready to get moving with things and learn about their body. And again, how to apply things to themselves, but then also cut through all the BS as well too, right? And again, what actually works for you specifically. So if you are interested in that, there's a link in the show notes, or you can reach out to me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_, and that's where I'm most active and we can chat there. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic. So let's talk about how to build muscle in a deficit. So building muscle is energetically expensive, and it is lower on your body's priority list to add more muscle than what you already have. I think that's a big distinction there, is what you already have, because you know muscle is important for movement, and we do need muscle. So it's not, you're not going to build any, but there does come a point to where it's like adding more, you have to give your body a reason to do it. But in saying that, adding more is really low on your body's priority list, especially when we're in a calorie deficit and energy resources are a bit limited. So again, your body really needs a strong reason to continue investing resources into this energy expensive process, and something that's just lower on the priority list, right? That's why ultimately it is tougher to build muscle in a deficit, for those reasons, because your body's, hey, we don't have a lot of energy coming in. We got to use this little bit of energy that we have towards other things. Think of muscle as, when you are bringing in a lot of money, think of it as, all right, hey, we got plenty of money coming in. We can now start to go spend our money on things that are important to us, but we have enough money to be able to do that. Where when you don't have enough money coming in, it's, hey, we have to dial back and focus on the essentials and more of our bare minimum needs there. And so that's a good way to think about it. So it absolutely can happen in a deficit, but it doesn't happen by accident. We have to be very strategic. We have to be again, it just isn't going to happen by accident. You're just not going to fall into building muscle here. Again, so what we're going to do today is we're going to go over how to build muscle in a deficit, but I also want to hit some common mistakes, thought process around building muscle in a deficit. I want to go over what determines your muscle growth potential in these states, and then the inputs that matter, so that you can think of these as, hey, here's the things that you actually need to do in this process. I think no matter what, this is a good episode on how to at least retain as much muscle as possible in a deficit. And I think if you can take these strategies, whether you can build muscle or not in a deficit, or again, where you fall in this, you will find that you will probably look better in your fat loss phase if you apply these things that we discuss here today. So let's first dive into the 3 common mistakes, more thought processes than anything. So number 1 is, this is people thinking it isn't possible. Many people think you can't build muscle in a deficit, so they end up being out of a deficit when they could use a deficit, right? And then others think that you need to be in a surplus to build muscle, so then they end up gaining more body fat than they need to, right? So it's like you end up with you're not really maximizing your body composition. Now, it is important to note that muscle growth is not maximized in a deficit, but it can still happen. And in saying this, some people do need to be at maintenance or in a small surplus to build muscle. You're not just going to, we'll talk about what those factors are that will impact that, but you do need at some point to be at maintenance or in a small surplus to build muscle. But I think really this comes back to people that think they can't do it, then they end up not really doing things that are going to allow for muscle retention and muscle growth to happen, right? So, hey, I'll just do weight training later, or they maybe focus a little bit more on cardio or high intensity kind of workouts to quote unquote burn fat, right? And they don't put as much stock into building muscle. So that's where you'd see that. But then, like I said, the other side is people think that they need to be in that surplus. So then they gain weight and push a surplus when they don't need to. So they gain extra body fat. And again, we just get further away from an ideal body composition that we would want, right? And again, when we talk an ideal body composition, we're talking, hey, you look like you lift, you got some toneness to your body, you got good definition in your arms, legs, etc. on there. That's what we're looking at with that. Next kind of common mistake from a thought process perspective is thinking you can always do it. So this is the other problem, is that then people think they can stay in this forever. And again, the slower progress of building muscle itself, right? I didn't really hit on that earlier, but building muscle is a slow process no matter what, right? Even if you're in at maintenance or a small surplus, it's already a slow process, but then we slow it down even more by being in a deficit. And as you get leaner and improve your inputs and you build more muscle, this process that's already slow, and then it's going to be slower in a deficit, is going to get even slower over time. And so eventually you do need to get out of a deficit, right? This is going to be people that do get themselves caught in what I call artificially low maintenance calories, and that low energy availability state, where they want to keep getting leaner, but then they don't ever want to see their weight come up any amount. And then you just get stuck here, right? You get stuck at artificially low maintenance calories, which again has some downstream impacts long term, probably not in the short term, but long term, you're definitely going to spin your wheels. Your performance probably isn't going to be as well. And then you're going to run some risks of micronutrient deficiencies, bone health issues. And just again, you're not going to build as much muscle in this state, right? On the flip side, it's like you got some people that think it's not possible at all. And then you have people that they try to be here for too long and they think you can always be here. But this is going to decrease the further you get into it. And then the third kind of common mistake from a thought process perspective is thinking it's black and white. So people think it's an on or off switch, right? It's like you either building maximal muscle or you don't build any at all, right? But there's a spectrum here, right? There's everything in between max muscle growth and no muscle growth, right? There's literally everything in between. You're talking, hey, a little bit more. It's hard to put numbers on it, but again, let's say this is just to put numbers on this, let's say 10 units is the max that you can build at any one time. There's everything from 1 to 0, or even there's everything from 0 to 10, right? It could be 1 unit, it could be 2, it could be 3. Where you fall on that is ultimately going to come down to that. It's ultimately going to come down to your muscle growth potential and inputs, right? But this is the big thing that I see happen with a lot of people is they do think too binary, too black and white with muscle growth in a deficit. It's like it either happens or it doesn't. But again, there's where you fall on this, your muscle growth potential, your inputs are all going to dictate how much you can have. Now, I'm saying that if 10, let's just say 10 was the max that it could be, in most situations, if you've been training for at least a little bit, you're probably never going to be at 10 in, say, in a deficit, right? Maybe it's closer to 6 to 7, depending on where you're at there, right? And again, I'm just making this up so you can visualize what that may look like. And then again, if you're at maintenance or small surplus, that's in good inputs, that's where you can push close to that 9, 10 side of things there with that. So again, we just have to get away from thinking it's black or white. So just to sum those three up, it's one, people think it's not possible when it totally is. People spending too long there and thinking that they can do it forever and you can't. And then the third is just thinking too black or white with it, thinking you're building max muscle or you're not, but there's literally everything in between there. Okay, so that, again, one of the things I said that determines how much muscle you can build in a deficit is going to depend on your muscle growth potential plus your inputs. So what determines muscle growth potential? That's going to come down to your body fat. So body fat matters. The higher your body fat is, the higher your muscle growth potential in a deficit tends to be. Just because, again, body fat will be a form of stored energy, and which helps with the deficit, right? Because your body's, okay, cool. Yes, we are in a deficit, which will sound some alarms in your body no matter what. But the higher your body fat percentages, those alarms are a lot quieter, right? As you get leaner and you're in a deficit, those alarms become a lot louder. And that's what's going to happen. You're going to find that the leaner you get, the lower your muscle growth potential is going to be in a deficit, right? So this is where if somebody has been fat loss dieting for a while, or they tried to continue to build muscle for extended periods of time in a deficit, like you're just going to continue, like you're going to lower your muscle growth potential to the point to where you may get to 0 and you could dip into the negatives potentially there, right? Especially the leaner you get. I always say this is where like competitive bodybuilders, especially natural ones, as they get super close to stage, they get super, super lean. You're really like, you building muscle is essentially maintaining as much as possible. And even that can become a very challenging situation, even with perfect inputs there, right? Because just how lean that people need to get nowadays for some of these competitions. That's pretty crazy. So body fat matters. That's going to give you more muscle growth potential. Now, obviously, the higher your body fat percentages, there's some things that could slightly alter your ability to build muscle. But generally speaking, if your inputs are in check and you're at higher body fat percentage, you're going to build some muscle. You're just going to be at a higher muscle growth potential in that situation there. But the leaner you get, the lower that muscle growth potential gets. Next, we have current muscle mass matters here as well too, right? The more muscle you have, the less likely you are to build significant amounts of muscle in a deficit. And again, for some with a lot of muscle, maybe even none, like you just to go back to those competitors, right? Like again, the more muscle you have and the leaner you get, like you will need to be really on top of things. Again, things like the TRT, exogenous testosterone that are getting you outside of those physiological levels, like your ability does go up in that situation, right? On the flip side, the less muscle you have, the higher your potential is. So you take somebody with moderate to high levels of body fat, low muscle mass. Again, that could be somebody that is quote unquote kind of more skinny fat in a way, right? Or again, you're just in that no man's land. Like you have good potential to build some muscle in a deficit. And you don't need to like gain weight or anything like that to be able to build more muscle. Whereas someone that is super lean and has a lot of muscle, again, it comes back to, hey, we're just trying to maintain what we have at this point. The size of the deficit matters too. Okay, so this is going to be the third thing that's going to determine your muscle growth potential in a deficit. how large your calorie deficit is going to impact that muscle growth potential. Generally speaking, the quicker the weight loss is, which would mean that it's a larger deficit, the lower the muscle growth potential becomes. Now, again, we still need to factor in the first two ones, right? It's not like these are independent of each other, that you do have to factor in all three of these. So again, if somebody is lean, has a lot of muscle, and is aggressively losing weight, they're probably losing muscle at least a little bit in that process, right? Again, you take someone that is higher body fat, low amount of muscle, and they are a bit more aggressive, they still may have a little bit more muscle growth potential. Now, again, if the size of the deficit was more moderate instead of aggressive, maybe their muscle growth potential goes from 1 to 3 or something like that, right? Like, it just depends. Just to give you numbers there, those numbers don't mean anything other than like just to visually understand, or yeah, just to understand what I'm talking about here. So again, the quicker we go, the lower the muscle growth potential becomes, right? Now, I'm saying that for some people, slower weight loss may not be the thing that they want to do, right? It's like, I don't really want to drag this on. I'd rather get in and get out with it. So then again, we just have to understand that, okay, in that situation, you may not be building muscle, and it does come down to just trying to maintain what you have during that time and then getting back to, say, maintenance or whatever it may be, right? But we could also go a little bit slower, have a smaller deficit, and you could get more muscle growth out of that. But you're also staying a little bit longer in this phase when you could be building muscle a little bit more efficiently at maintenance, but you're not going to be losing body fat in that situation, right? So again, it's all give and take here with this. But like I said, these three largely determine your muscle growth potential, and we have to take all three into consideration. We can't, like I said, we can't think of them independently. We have to think of all of them at the same time, and they all impact each other here. So now, in saying that, that's our muscle growth potential. Now, your inputs are going to determine whether you actually build muscle within that potential that we have, okay? So now this is where we can get into the nitty gritty of, okay, what are the things that we can actually do to build muscle, right? Again, the things that we've gone over so far give you an idea of, okay, here's where I can potentially expect to, like, can I expect to build muscle? And here's the thing, most people have a good amount of runway here, because a lot of times their inputs are not as dialed in as they think. They may have a couple of these, but all of them, one, it's hard to get all of them firing on all cylinders, but most people have a lot of wiggle room in each one and have multiple of these inputs that they can dial in a deficit to build muscle, and even outside of this, right? Like, even outside of a deficit as well too. All right, so we're gonna start with lifting, because that is the most important. Like, you have to lift. I made this post the other day. What actually determines muscle growth? You got to send the stimulus, right? So we do need to tell the body to maintain what we have, and you have to do that through resistance training. So if you're not resistance training, we can kiss any sort of muscle growth or muscle retention out of the window when we're in a deficit. So we do need to lift weights. As far as volume goes, we need to lift, and then we need to do the amount of training volume you can recover from and still have quality sets. So this isn't necessarily a time to go crazy with volume. This doesn't mean you need to do a ton of volume, but I also wouldn't necessarily say you need to go to like super low volumes either. I think it would be beneficial to figure out, hey, what is that sweet spot for me to recover, still have quality sets, and adjust from there. But again, we also need to have the quality side of things in there. Probably a good way to go about this is, this may be a bit lower than what you can do during maintenance or a surplus. Now, in saying that, the deficit size, body fat level, and overall inputs matter greatly here. At the beginning of a fat loss phase, you could probably keep things around the same and then adjust if you need to. But to be on the safe side, it wouldn't hurt to just go slightly lower, maybe a couple less sets per muscle group during this time, right? But the key takeaway is, we don't want to slash volume, but this isn't the time that we would want to increase it from what we've been doing at maintenance or surplus there. I think people overthink the exact amount of volume. There's not going to be a sweet spot. There's probably a range. And I think if you can fall within that 6 to 15 set range per muscle group per week, you're probably in a good spot. If you were doing 15 sets, maybe you drop down to 12 to 13 per muscle group and just kind of test it out and see what happens, see how you're recovering, see what the quality looks like, etc. Because again, really at the end of the day, we need to do enough, but we also need to have a good stimulus, and good stimulus being, hey, can you put in quality sets? And if you're doing higher volumes in a deficit and now your quality goes down, it's like you could probably get away with doing less sets and improving your quality, and then that's going to save resources, recovery resources to put towards the deficit, etc. There. So that's the thought process that I'm trying to have here with this, is we just want to try to get the most out of probably the least amount of possible in a deficit. But if building muscle does become something that we are trying to do, and that's the whole point of this post, it would be worth it to see how high you can get it while recovering. But that doesn't mean increase it like crazy. You probably don't want to do more than what you were doing at maintenance or a surplus there. But finally, like I said, deficit size, body fat level, and overall inputs matter greatly here. Volume should be evenly distributed based on needs. So what I mean by that is, if you do have needs where your upper body needs a little bit more volume, or your lower body needs less or more, or whatever it may be, then you still want to try and keep that relatively the same. What I would be careful with is doing like specialization phases. Save those for maintenance or surplus phases. Specialization phase being something where you just do a little bit more volume or you put a little bit more time and effort into one muscle group or multiple muscle groups and put the rest on maintenance. Everything should be relatively similar, but it does need to be somewhat based on your needs and just your general volume needs for each muscle group. And again, if you don't know what that is, keep everything relatively the same. And over time, you can start to get that dialed in, right? So for me, I've learned over time that my legs just need less volume. I don't need to do as much volume for them. And the more volume I do, it does tend to just beat me up. And so it's like I do a little bit less in my lower body relative to my upper body. But that may not be the case for everyone. But like I said, to be safe, keep everything the same. And then over time, if you have a coach or someone to help you with that to figure out what your volume needs look like, then you can obviously do that over time there. My next big thing here is spreading the stimulus out throughout the week. Try and hit each muscle group at a minimum 2 times per week, probably 2 times per week for pretty much every single one, but you could go up to 3 times per week on some potentially there. I'm not a fan of bro splits during this time. Try not to go too long without a stimulus to the muscle. So like, for example, I would much rather have somebody do, let's just think one muscle group here, not necessarily lifting in general. Monday and Thursday is going to be better than trying to lump everything together, right? Again, if that's the only way you can do it, that's fine. You have to do it that way. But if you have the option to be able to be flexible with your days that you can lift, then I would much rather prefer you spread it out again, like I said there, and not Monday, Thursday versus, hey, I can only train Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It's like, can you split that up a little bit there, right? So again, splitting it up. And then I generally prefer in this phase closer to 6 to 15 reps, maybe even closer to 6 to 12, 6 to 10 reps most of the time in a deficit. And then 0 to 2 RAR most of the time. I'm also not a big fan of pump focused training during this time. A lot of people will be like, oh, dude, that's what the pro bodybuilders do. They just do like a bunch of pump work, et cetera. Again, I wouldn't do that really much at all for muscle growth for anybody at any time, but definitely in a fat loss phase when you're trying to build some muscle in a deficit. Big reason I'm not a fan of higher reps, why I like that 6 to 10 rep range better in a deficit is when we're in a deficit, we have less calories coming in. And for any sort of training that we do, our fatigue can feel harder at any given output relative to when you're at maintenance or surplus. And we tend to fatigue out deep, like later into sets. And so if we're doing, and just in general, again, this is based on the research. Take that for what it's worth. It doesn't mean everything, it's averages, but people tend to be a little bit further away from failure when they go higher rep range, and you need to probably get a little bit closer to failure in higher rep range. So you combine all those things and it's like, it's just not the most productive training. And so that's where I fall in that 6 to 10 rep range, because with the 6 to 10 rep range, also, we tend to be better at knowing what our reps in reserve are. And you probably can stay a rep or two away from failure and still build muscle. So that to me ends up being why I like that a lot for building muscle there. So that's lifting. Those would be some things I would look at there. Next, obviously protein is going to be super important. If we are going to build muscle in a deficit, protein should generally be around 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight or higher. And I would almost potentially push slightly higher upward. When I say higher, I think around 1 gram is good. If you want to go a little bit higher for other reasons that you like it, et cetera, you can certainly do that. Upwards of 1.2 to 1.5 grams per pound of body weight. With leaner individuals and those in larger deficits often benefiting from the higher ranges. So this would be a time where I would probably want to push you a little bit higher from a protein perspective. Outside of that, if you're at maintenance or surplus, because we have plenty of resources available, you probably can get away with 0.7, 0.8 per gram, pounds per gram of body weight, and you would be good. But in this situation, to really build muscle, I would recommend pushing a little bit on the higher end of this 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight and even potentially higher. Next, I do want to make sure we spread our protein across 3 to 6 feedings throughout the day and make sure we get a minimum of 12 to 30 grams per feeding each time we do that, right? What I wouldn't want to see is you go 6 hours without 20-ish grams of protein. Again, we know in the research that total protein intake for the day is most important, but when we talk about trying to maximize building muscle in a deficit, these things, in my opinion, become a little bit more important. Whereas again, when you're in maintenance, you probably, or surplus, you could probably get away with like timing being a little less important because you just have more resources available at any one time there. So those would be the two things with protein. And again, anytime they do any body recomp literature, which this is essentially what it is, right? This is simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain. Protein is a very important factor there. Carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are another one. So you don't need extremely high carb intake to build muscle in a deficit, which again, you have a limited amount of calories that you have. So you can only fit so many carbohydrates in anyways, but completely eliminating carbs can make training performance, recovery, and muscle growth more difficult, as carbs are going to help fuel training, support recovery, and help maintain training volume and performance while dieting. So we probably are going to have to lower our carbohydrate intake from what it typically is because we just have less calories in a deficit, but we don't want to zap it to zero. You don't want to completely decrease your carbohydrates. In saying that, I would prioritize a larger portion of your daily carbs around training. And that's going to help you get more out of training, help you get quality training, which is going to be a huge factor in building some muscle in a deficit. Because again, remember, the body needs a reason to add muscle, especially in a deficit. And the more you have, for sure, it needs a reason to do that. So carbohydrates can become super important. And again, like I said, trying to get more around your training is going to be super important here. And then we have nutrition around workouts, right? So this kind of goes off of that. Try to have food within 1 to 3 hours before and after training. Again, if you train first thing in the morning and you just have to train fasted, okay, that's fine. But then you definitely want something after, as soon as possible after. I don't think that's necessarily the best strategy for trying to maximize muscle growth in a deficit. But if you have to do it, you have to do it. And we just have to work with what we can. And definitely getting some food in after would be super important. There is one other thing that we can potentially do to help offset that. And I'll talk about that in a minute when we go to supplements. But again, we're just looking at, hey, let's make sure we get some nutrition around our training. We don't want to go too long without that. So there with that. All right, then we have sleep and circadian rhythm. So again, poor sleep and circadian disruption are going to significantly reduce your ability to recover and build muscle in a deficit, right? It's probably going to lower, like your body, again, is going to be like even less likely to want to add muscle in a deficit. It's not going to be as good, right? So you're not going to be able to have as many high quality sets, which in turn is going to impact your ability to push training and actually build muscle, because we know that the training side of things is the most important. But also when you don't get good sleep, you're like, you just don't have that extra oomph in your training, and you do need that during a deficit. And then you combine that with you're in a deficit, which impacts that. It can just be really hard to push your training there. But even from just a hormonal perspective, et cetera, we're probably not putting ourselves in the best position to build muscle if we're not getting good sleep there. And then same thing with circadian rhythm. Obviously, your circadian rhythm goes hand in hand with sleep. It's not only sleep, but it does go hand in hand with it. And so if that process is off, you may not get as good of sleep. And again, you may just find that your motivation's lower. You don't have that extra oomph in training. And even from a metabolic health standpoint, probably going to put us at somewhat of a disadvantage there too. There was some research that showed, hey, they had two groups in a deficit. One was oh crap, I forgot what it was now, but it was something where either I think one group slept for 8 hours, one group slept for 4 hours, and the group that slept for 4 hours, they both lost the same amount of weight. But the group that was sleeping 4 hours during that study, I think it was like a week or two long, they lost more muscle in the process. Now, in saying that, when you dive deeper into the study, they weren't weight training, at least from what I remember seeing. So that's a huge piece of it, right? Like, what would that change if they were weight training? Would they have not lost any muscle then? Who knows? But in saying that, they did lose some muscle, but they still lost the same amount of weight, right? So then it's, hey, yeah, we're losing weight, but what does it look like from a body composition perspective there? So I think the sleep thing is, yes, a little bit directly, but less directly and more indirectly, it's going to impact things on there. Just remember, one poor night of sleep is not problematic. A couple nights of poor sleep, not necessarily problematic, but definitely want to look into it. And you probably want to course correct that as soon as possible. But if we're consistently sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, extended periods of time, that's where things are going to start to add up there with that. Okay, then we also need to look at stress load management. So you need to make sure your overall stress load is managed. If you're consistently overloading yourself with stressors, muscle growth becomes much tougher to come by in a deficit. So I have my stress bucket analogy. I made a post on this last week. And essentially what I was saying is, if that stress bucket is overloading, which many things fall into stressors, right? That fall into that. Yes, it's psychological stress, like that feeling of stress. Hey, you had something happen from a financial standpoint, et cetera. That definitely falls into it. Training is a stressor. Body composition is a stressor. Your nutrition. So if you're in a deficit, that is a stressor on the body. Circadian rhythm, sleep can be a stressor on the body. Poor food quality, et cetera. These things can all be stressors on the body. And so if you have a lot of things in there and that bucket's overflowing, adaptation is less likely to happen. So again, we just have to consider, okay, if we know a deficit's a stressor, that is going to take a chunk of it. We're going to have to train hard, so that's going to take up a chunk of it. We have to just make sure that we're not overloading our body, because otherwise all this just doesn't matter. You do need to make sure that you are managing overall stress on the body and just how many stressors you are pushing your body towards. Because again, otherwise it's like a deficit by itself is not it's a stressor, but that's not a bad thing. Again, training is a good stressor, but it is a stressor, and we have to consider these things here. And if we're just putting too many stressors and we're not accounting for stress management, the entire load of everything that we're doing, that's where you can run into some issues there. So again, we have to watch that. It's like, all right, if we're going to be in a deficit and try and build muscle, again, where can we, is sleep the thing that is going to help us there? Is it, hey, maybe you need to take a couple other things off of your plate, right? These are all things that we have to consider in this process. All right, so now let's go to cardio and steps, because that kind of falls into the stress load management side of things, right? Because training load management falls within a stressor on the body. So Again, I do recommend keeping in some cardio for obviously cardiovascular fitness purposes, but it can be another lever to help create a calorie deficit. So we can use it that way. Steps should generally stay around 8 to 10K plus per day. Again, we need some movement. However, you do want to be careful with not overdoing either of them, right? Especially the cardio, because that's going to be the one that is going to be slightly more fatiguing. The steps, you do have a little bit more wiggle room because they just aren't as fatiguing as dedicated cardio is. But once you get north of that 15 to 20K, you're going to run into some recovery issues, right? It does start again, steps in themselves is not very fatiguing on the body. And it's probably pro recovery to get moving to a point. But then eventually, as you continue to do more and more, it will likely start to add to your stress load. And you just need to consider that there. And just from a time, then it's like now you're dedicating a lot of time to that. Now that means that you're a little bit more stressed from a time management perspective. That's adding stress. So you have to just consider all these things there. But again, the more you do, the greater the risk we run of too much training relative to recovery. So we know, again, our bucket is probably a little bit more full. So we just have to consider that. Too much training relative to your nutrition intake, because again, you're just not bringing in as much calories. So our recovery resources are lower, et cetera. And then creating too large of a calorie deficit. As we start to create too large of a calorie deficit, now that is going to impact your ability to build muscle. Now the body's smart and will adapt, but again, that can become problematic there. So we just want to be careful with creating too large of a deficit. If you are going to do a lot of movement or steps or cardio, you may, in a paradoxical way, you may have to increase your caloric intake to match that there. Okay, so again, cardio and steps, we want to do them. We just want to be careful with how much we dose, right? So that comes back to training load management on there. So let's talk supplements. So what are some supplements? Definitely would keep creatine in for sure. Definitely keep that in. A lot of people will take it out because it's like, oh, I lose weight when I take it out, or I gain weight when I put it back in. Just leave it in, you need it. It's going to be super helpful during a deficit. I do think EAAs, so essential amino acids, could be beneficial for older individuals. We're talking 40, 50, 60 plus, those training fasted. So again, this comes back to if you do have to train fasted, probably not a bad idea to take some essential amino acids during that. Easy to slip into a drink and have that, or those struggling to hit protein targets. But if you are struggling to hit protein targets, I would say you're going to have a tough time adding muscle, and that needs to be something that we need to look at over taking EAAs. But I do think there's some benefit to taking those. Outside of that, my core list remains the same: fish oil, vitamin D, magnesium. Vitamin D, make sure you take some K2 with that as well too. So those are the inputs. I think if we can nail those, understand where you fall on the muscle growth potential, and maybe hopefully this helped you get away from some of those common mindset mistakes that you had around it, you should be able to build some muscle, right? What I will say on this though is if you enjoy a faster approach for fat loss, then really the primary goal becomes retaining as much muscle as possible. And all these things still stay the same, but we just probably have to watch stress load management a little bit more. We probably have to watch training load management as well too in that state. But still, some people would be able to build a little muscle depending on their muscle growth potential there. So TLDR, muscle growth in a deficit is possible, but it isn't black or white, and it's on a spectrum depending on your muscle growth potential and inputs. It's not going to be maximized in a deficit, and eventually you need to get out of a deficit in general, but especially if you want to continue to build more muscle, you'll definitely need to get out of a deficit to build more muscle. But anyways, even if you don't want to build more muscle, you do still need to get out of a deficit at some point in time there. So I hope this gives you some insight into how to build muscle in a deficit, and you took some things away. So if you are interested if you have any questions on this, reach out to me, Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. And if you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find it. So that's it for this episode. I will chat with you guys next time.